stumbling along the sidewalk, clearly intoxicated, because he was just at a bar. But they also saw something else, and that was a double parked vehicle. And this vehicle started to slowly trail him, matching his pace, and even turning when he turned. Just creepy as hell. And Patrick would be last seen near East 90th Street, heading toward the direction of the East River. And at this point, by witness accounts, the car was still following him. And after that, Patrick McNeil would never be seen alive again. So obviously his family would notice that Patrick went missing, and they would call it into the police. So the NYPD and his family and countless volunteers in New York searched tirelessly for Patrick, and they would distribute over 10,000 posters, turning it into one of the city's most famous missing persons cases. But weeks and weeks would pass, and then 50 days later, on April 7th, 1997, his body would be found floating in the East River near a pier in Brooklyn, which was roughly 12 miles from where he was last seen. And he would be found wearing only jeans and socks, floating face up in the water, which is uncommon for accidental drownings. And the medical examiner listed the cause of death as drowning. The manner of death undetermined. And his blood alcohol content was actually recorded at 0.16, which is twice the legal limit to drive. But he wasn't driving, he was just walking. But there was unusual details that stood out, because despite the cold temperatures, fly larvae were discovered on the body, which is an anomaly since insect activity is typically dormant in winter months. Dr. Cyril Wett would even quote to say,
"I'm saying that the fly larvae have been laid in the groin area. It's an indoor fly. Could not have been an outdoor fly. It was an indoor fly, and the larvae were there. Did not move ahead into the later stage. So we have a body that was already dead before it was placed in the water. I would call it homicide. Yes."
And there were also reported signs that Patrick may have been bound and possibly burned before being placed in the water. And retired NYPD detective Kevin Gannon, who worked this case, would later state that he believed Patrick McNeil had been abducted, held for an extended period of time, and then was murdered. And that he wasn't just a simple victim of accidental drowning. But Patrick's case would just close. But Kevin Gannon's investigation had only just begun. And soon he would find other young men with eerily similar profiles who also vanished near water, who were also ruled as just drownings, but were completely unexplained. So Patrick McNeil's case might have been the beginning, but it didn't end with him, because in the years that followed, similar cases began surfacing. And not just in New York, but across the country. Different cities, same victim profile, and the same tragic end. Young men in their early 20s, college students, athletes, and high performers. And in some of those cases where the bodies were found, something else appeared nearby. Something seemingly innocuous. And it was a smiley face. And then there was Lucas Homan, and he would be 21 years old when he was last seen at Oktoberfest in La Crosse, Wisconsin in September 2006. And during Oktoberfest, he would actually become separated with his friends at the festivities. And days later, his body would be found near the shore of the Mississippi River. And the autopsy would note injuries to his head, hands, and arms, as well as a footprint-shaped bruise on his forehead. And authorities would initially rule this as an accidental drowning. But near the site where he was found was another smiley face. Which, like, also with the amount of bruises on this person, doesn't it look like he was beat and held captive and then thrown in the river? And the neglect in these cases is astounding. And then there was Todd Gieb, and he would vanish when he was only 22 years old while attending a bonfire party in rural Michigan in June of 2005. And at the bonfire, eventually he would kind of disappear, and then he would call his friend saying, "I'm in a field." But then the call would completely drop, and he would never be heard from again until he was found 3 weeks later with his body found in a private lake. And what's odd is that he was found upright in the water with his head and shoulders above the surface. A very just deeply unnatural position for a drowning victim. And what's also odd is that that lake had been searched previously as well. So it's almost like he was dumped in this lake later on after the first search was done. And a toxicology screen would indicate that alcohol and antidepressants were found in his system. But he was reportedly not suffering from any sort of depression at the time. But something else didn't add up, because his body showed minimal decomposition, which was extremely unusual given that it would have been present if he actually died on the day of his disappearance, leading experts to question whether he had been in the water the entire time, or whether he had been somewhere else before he had died. And to boot, nearby on a tree was, you guessed it, a painted smiley face. Tommy Booth was 24 when he disappeared from a bar in Woodland, Pennsylvania on January 19th, 2008, and he was celebrating a friend's 21st birthday on that night. And surveillance cameras would show that Tommy would enter the bar, but he would never leave. And 2 weeks later, his body would be discovered in a creek behind the bar, and he would be found with full rigor mortis, which usually dissipates somewhere between 24 to 36 hours after death. And for those of you who don't know what rigor mortis is, it's when the body gets really stiff after death, like almost immovable. And this actually suggested that he hadn't been in the water for the full duration of his disappearance. And spray painted nearby, someone had left an eerie smiley face. And then there was William Hurley, a 24-year-old Navy veteran who disappeared after leaving a Boston Bruins game on October of 2009. Before he left, he would call his fiancée for a ride, but when she arrived shortly after, he was gone. And 6 days later, his body was recovered from the Charles River. And an autopsy found blunt force trauma to his head, eye socket, and his leg. And toxicology revealed something else, which was alcohol and GHB, a drug often used to incapacitate victims. And his death would be ruled an undetermined drowning. And once again, there was a smiley face near the river. And then there was 21-year-old Chris Jenkins. He was a student at the University of Minnesota, and on Halloween night, 2002, he left a bar in downtown Minneapolis and was never seen again. And 4 months later, his body would be recovered from the Mississippi River, and he was still fully dressed in his Halloween costume. So authorities initially ruled this as an accidental drowning. But in 2006, after years of pressure from his family, the Minneapolis Police Department reclassified his death as a homicide. It's just so sad that the family had to pressure the police into considering this case as a homicide. Do your f***ing job. And to Detective Kevin Gannon, the detective who was on Patrick McNeil's case, who was the first case, this wasn't just a win for the family. It was sort of validation. Proof that one of the earlier cases had been mishandled and that it could fit the pattern he had begun tracking. Because one case is a tragedy and two is maybe a coincidence. But when young men across the country begin vanishing under almost identical circumstances, after nights out drinking, always found in water, often with smiley face graffiti nearby, at what point do you stop calling it chance? And that is the exact question retired detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, who actually joined the Gannon investigation, were asking. Because they weren't seeing isolated drownings. They were seeing a pattern emerge. A mark, a symbol, a face. And sometimes it was large and cartoonish, and other times it was kind of hastily scrawled, but it was seemingly always nearby and always just out of place enough to feel wrong. But to most investigators, these were just coincidences, because graffiti is, in fact, pretty much everywhere, and smiley faces are extremely common. But to Gannon and Duarte, they were signatures, though they weren't left at every single crime scene, so they were not predictable, but seemingly intentional, enough to at least suggest taunting or a pattern or a ritual. So by the mid-2000s, what started as a lingering suspicion had grown into something far more disturbing. And retired NYPD detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte weren't just reviewing cold cases at this point. They were tracking the pattern, as I said before. And this pattern spanned dozens of cities, and it was a pattern that no one else seemed to be seeing for some reason. So by this point, the team had compiled a list of over 40 young men, and all of them were found in bodies of water and ruled as drownings, and all just deemed accidents. But to Gannon and Duarte, the similarities were just impossible to ignore. But to police departments, they were just unrelated tragedies. So Gannon and Duarte started to put all of these pieces together, and a map started to take shape. And the shape was not random. And to make sense of it, the team needed more than investigative instinct. They needed someone who could look at the data and explain from the outside. And that's when Professor Dr. Lee Gilbertson came into the picture. He was a criminal justice professor and expert in organized criminal behavior from St. Cloud University in Minnesota. And Gilbertson hadn't necessarily set out to solve the case. In fact, his introduction actually came through the classroom, because he would actually assign the deaths of several